indeed bear with me. Certainly, false teachers of that day and in that area had sounded off concerning their praise, how great they were. And of course, as Paul explains, that's really a foolish move to make. It's not very wise for us to be patting ourselves on the back. And so Paul is kind of basically, I guess it's a figure of speech, bear with my foolishness for just a minute, or my folly. And so Paul is going to explain himself, explain some things. He expresses his great concern for them to begin with, verses 2, 3, and 4, and I think that was wise, that's how he began. Most of all, he wants them to be pure. He wants them to be faithful to Christ. And Paul, I guess these were words of endearment. He said, I am jealous over you with a godly or a God-like jealousy. Expresses a very strong affection for them because of the tie that he has with the congregation. And he says, I have espoused you to one husband. Certainly, that is, he has taught them the doctrine of Christ. And in their obedience, they have experienced a spiritual marriage, being a part of the church, which is the bride of Christ, and to Christ, the groomsman. And so his desire, though, and he mentions it there in that reading, his desire is for them to be chaste as a virgin to Christ. Don't step back from what you've accepted, what you've agreed to, what you know to be the truth. Don't step back from that. And certainly don't go into some other relationship with a false god. So he expresses to them his fears. So there are fears that we all have. I was talking to one today about how sad it is when someone obeys the gospel and not long after they fall away. It's very sad that they, like Eve, and this is Paul's statement, that they, like Eve, are beguiled or tricked into believing other things. So this is what these are the feelings of Paul. Then he begins, I guess, to uphold himself or to defend himself. He's not trying to pat himself on the back and say that I'm the greatest thing that's ever lived. Actually, we're going to go ahead and read 5 and 6. He said, for I suppose I was not one whit behind the very chiefest apostles. Paul has no problem in standing and saying, I am on equal footing with them. Evidently, there must have been those who were saying the opposite. There must have been those who were even claiming, as we study more, that he wasn't even an apostle at all. Paul says that though I be rude in speech, yet not in knowledge. Paul says, I know what I'm talking about. But we have been thoroughly made, he says, manifest among you in all things. You stop and you think about his statements here. Statements that he shouldn't even have to make. They have been around Paul. They have known Paul. So it's pretty evident that he had opponents. Opponents that came from out of Corinth. They came here and now they are working against Paul. So he is being basically, the way I see this, he's being forced to say things that he normally would not have said. What really matters about him and his relationship is this. His knowledge was not lacking as an apostle. He had complete and full knowledge. His knowledge is compared to the other apostles, and that's paramount. That's really, really important. He was just as knowledgeable as they were. He was had every advantage that they had. And I think this has been openly demonstrated throughout Paul's life, regardless of where he went. It's been demonstrated. Even when he had discussions with the apostles, he didn't cower down as being inferior, as he would or had to do with Peter. He would even stand up and face him because of his wrongdoing. So that brings us basically up to verse 7. Paul now deals with a very touchy and a very personal thing, or a personal matter. Let's read verses 7 through 11 together. Paul said, have I committed an offense in abasing myself that you might be exalted? Because I preached to you the gospel of God freely. Have I offended you? Have I hurt you because I don't charge you to come preach? Must have been an accusation, right? Sounds like there was. But he reminds them, I didn't charge you. A question before I read any further. Why might he not charge them? Why might he not ask them to support him?
You think he knew they couldn't afford it?
No, I don't think. It's a good thought, but I don't think that's it.
Not according to, back to chapter 9.
Yeah, we back up a
He was
little.
talking about, I think it was more of the fact that they knew his motives were pure, that he wasn't trying to take advantage of them, as no doubt some was trying to do. I mean, if he was willing to do this for nothing, that's a lot different than someone saying, I've got to have X number of dollars or whatever. And even though that's not wrong, those who plow the field, so to speak, the ox that plows the field, should eat of that. It's an illustration from the Old Testament that Paul uses. But I wonder if that's not the case, that again, to make sure they knew his motives were pure.
Yeah, if I'm coming there free of charge, then the only reason I must be coming is I truly care about you.
It's not a hireling.
Yeah, I'm not a hireling. Good point. And there were those who were charging him in that, or speaking of him in that frame or in that way. And so Paul is actually taking arguments away from those who would accuse him before the thing ever happens. And it's very wise that he did so. Verse 8, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. So basically what Paul is saying, we'll come back and discuss all this. Well, listen, I've been supported by the congregation so I can come here and do the work that needs to be done here. Number 9, and when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I've kept nothing, or rather I've kept myself from being burdensome to you, and so will keep myself. So I'm not charging you anything. I've not asked you to support me. I've not asked for a place to lodge or a place to eat or something to eat. And Paul says, I'm going to continue to do that. That's going to be what I do from this point forward, verse 10. As the truth of Christ is in me, no man shall stop me of this boasting in the regions of Achaia. Wherefore, because I love you. Wherefore, because I love you not, God knoweth. Is it a matter that I love you or don't love you? God knows, and we do as well. So Paul had preached the gospel to them without support from them. And so was this wrong? Well, no, it's not wrong. And he's asking, was it wrong that I chose to work with my own hands? Was it wrong that I lowered myself in order to lift you up spiritually? So how did he lower himself? Probably, maybe we could say his standard of living might have been better. I guess there's a lot of ways you could look at how he lowered himself. But it appears to me that these were some things that were being said by the accusers of Paul. And it was as if they were accusing him of wronging the church at Corinth by not allowing them to support him. Well, that's ridiculous. Let's suppose we hold a gospel meeting. Let's suppose we hold it this spring. And this has been the case with everyone I've been involved with. And they come and hold the meeting and we say, what do we owe you? Well, whatever you can afford. If you can't afford it, if you just help me with gas, that would be. I've had just about every speaker tell me that same thing. These are humble men, Paul as well. Not here to make a dollar. I know one case of one brother who held a gospel meeting, in Jasper, Alabama. He asked for $1,200 lodging and gas, and they paid him. The day he left, when he got back home, he called and asked for another $1,000. They sent it to him. But they didn't recommend him for anyone else in the gospel meeting. I thought the audacity of asking for that was pretty bold. I wonder whether that man went there to earn a living or make money, or I don't know what his motive was. But even today, it's a common practice among men. There are people who work in the church and they do so without compensation. And I'm not opposed to paying anyone for any work they do. But it's true that men do that. Then why didn't Paul take the money? Well, his accusers, I think, had a sinister motive when it came to Paul. But Paul makes it clear that everything he did it for their good. He was there for their exaltation. He was there to help them so they would not have a hindrance to hearing the gospel of Christ. Now, what's that mean? Well, I'm coming, but I need to be supported. Oh, we can't do that. Well, we'll not have you. And it appears that might have been what some would have said, those who opposed him. So he's taking everything out of the way so we can come and teach them the gospel. You know, and Paul readily admits that he's not the greatest speaker on earth. That's what he. But I don't know that you could have any person love even more than Paul. Anyone who would have such a desire to preach the gospel and to do so before a congregation without charge, even to the point where he would ask another congregation to help him out financially. Paul says basically that I have robbed or taken other churches in order to continue doing the thing that I'm doing. And that's a pretty strong term, I've robbed. I think in Greek the word equivalent would have been I've ravaged someone else to see you be blessed. And as well as the Corinthians, their financial issues or the financial side of it, I guess probably what really hurt Paul is their ingratitude. Their ingratitude for other congregations who were supporting Paul, their ingratitude for Paul, because they received something free, no charge. Someone else is paying the bill. Even when he was in need of help, it was such a bad situation that he wouldn't ask them for help. So the principle Paul was following is pretty well seen. To go into the city, to preach, to start a congregation without having them to pay a cent. He wasn't going to burden them in any way to hinder their Christianity or their growth. And I think it was wise. He made it clear that no one would stop him from boasting about the good work that he's doing. No one would stop him from boasting about that Achaia region, specifically Macedonia. And he's boasting in what they have done for him. No one's going to stop him from that. So he's going to do that, and Paul said he would do it elsewhere. So was it a question of whether Paul loved them or not? No. That may have been somewhat of an accusation. But Paul said God knows, and this is all that counts, is that God knows. Well, there's others who knew. The faithful Christians at Corinth, they knew. The ones in Achaia that were supporting him, they knew. And Paul knew. And as an inspired writer, now we know. Not taking support had nothing to do with his lack of love. If anything else, it's the very opposite. Because of his great love, he said it's best that I don't ask for finances so they can manipulate it and turn it around. So now, Paul turns to his opponents. And in the next section, he's pretty bold. Let's read 12 through 15. Paul said, but what I do, that I will do, that I may cut off occasion from them which desire occasion, that wherein they glory, they may be found even as we. So Paul is doing what he's doing. and there are reasons for doing this thing. He wants to prevent them from having an occasion to work against him or to say things against him. He says, verse 13, for such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel. Don't be surprised that this is happening, is what he's saying. For Satan himself, listen, and Satan is their father, remember? He said that. For Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers also be transformed as ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. So he gives a reason for their acts, for the actions he's taking. He didn't want to give any opportunity for any type of criticism or any criticism in any way. So of his critics, boast, let them boast. But if they're going to be what they ought to be, they're going to have to be what Paul is. Paul continues, or plans to continue doing the work he's doing, to preach the gospel, to do so to new churches wherever he may go, and to do so without asking them or putting a burden on them. Paul wants to be sure that they know the only reason he's there is because of his great love for God, Christ, and for the people. Now, he characterizes them in this statement, in these statements. An apostle or a messenger. Paul is an apostle himself. In a sense, those who are opposing Paul are apostles of Satan. They are messengers. They're sham artists. I guess you could say they're counterfeits. They're masquerading as apostles of Christ, but they're not. They're apostles of the Father, and that would be Satan. You've heard the old term, and we say it a lot, or we used to say it a lot around here, call a spade a spade. A spade is a spade. That's what it is. So that's basically what Paul is opening up. People have the power to misrepresent him, and they are doing that. But in this case, the biggest misrepresentation is not of who Paul is, but who they are. Pretending to be men of God, but they're not. So they're very dishonest, they're very deceitful, they're very just evil people. They're doing what Satan has done throughout man's history. These scam artists, pretending to be things they're not. You remember when he came to Eve in the garden, deceived her. Taking God's word, manipulating that word, and deceiving a person. When he was doing those things in the Garden of Eden, had Satan not turned himself into a messenger of light? Didn't he, in some respect, appear to be knowledgeable and wise? Well, yes. That's part of the deception. He didn't do so by saying God is a liar or God is not just blatantly. Not at first. Basically, he does call God that, but that's not how he starts the trickery. He plays on her emotions. He plays on her fleshly desires. He was pretending to be something he wasn't, and so were these people. The men or the women, the followers of Satan, use the same devices that Satan used in the Garden of Eden. They mix evil with good and make things look better than they ought to. You remember when Jesus talked about the fact that we should beware of wolves in sheep's clothing? That's the very same idea, the very same thing. Matthew 7, verse 15. And so these people are called ministers. But they're not doing the bidding of Christ. They're doing the bidding of Satan. Any comments? We do have it. We do? Question, how important is it to make a clear-cut distinction between truth and falsehood. It's very, very important that we do that. Never forget it when we're dealing with people in this world that they're either a messenger of Satan or a messenger of God. And we have to be very, very careful about the message we receive. We have to know what's right and wrong. You know, it's very, very wonderful to see Christian members of the body of Christ in each congregation. It's very wonderful to see these people and their devotion to Christ. And I think about this betrothal, so to speak. The church is the bride and Christ is the husband. And I think about that. That's a very, very beautiful, beautiful picture. And so we ought to remember that when we're being tempted to do things we shouldn't. I think about this. When people talk about themselves, it's pretty easy for someone to brag on themselves. I can be pretty bad about that. I really try not to. But it's pretty easy to talk about how good you are. Why is that true? We want people to think good of us. Sometimes to the point that it's foolishness. Isn't it true that when you open a book and read it, you know what the book says, right? If I'm living the life, people know what I am. I don't have to tell them. Paul's the same situation. In certain situations, it becomes a necessity, however, to defend yourself. This was one of those occasions. Paul didn't relish the idea of defending himself. He didn't go into this wanting to do that, but he had to. So let's look at verses 16 through 21.
Tony,
Yes.
before we go on, can I make a comment?
Yes.
You know, the church at Corinth, remember, this is 2 Corinthians, obviously, but the church at Corinth had so many issues, and division was certainly one of them. Go all the way back to the first chapter of 1 Corinthians, where Paul said that, this I say that every one of you saith, I am Paul, I am Apollos, I am of Cephas, and I am Christ. And then we come here to 2 Corinthians. And in this text, it becomes relatively clear that Paul is still dealing with some of that same nonsense. He starts off saying he's jealous of them. In other words, because I think he's fearing they're going back into apostasy or going to apostasy. And that they've been deceived. In verse 4, you've already discussed this, so I'm just trying to build a point here. For if he that cometh preaches another Jesus whom we have not preached, or if ye have received another spirit which we have not received, or another gospel which we have not accepted, you might bear well with him. Then verse 55, for I suppose I was not with behind the very chiefest of apostles. It's almost like, and then later we come on down here to the last couple of verses you read, for such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. Verse 13. It was like that they were putting their trust in whoever it was that was there over the words of Paul. And Paul's having to say, listen, I'm not below the chiefest of the apostles. And it reminds me of sometimes how people exalt men and think that certain men, they're going to put their trust in them. Reminds me back when I was preaching full-time here in I'll just say the Tri-Cities, there was a congregation that said they wouldn't hire anyone except you had a PhD.
Yep, I've heard that.
Well, I mean, and that was true. But would John the Baptist been able to preach that?
No, he would have been in trouble.
I mean, you could give a long list of individuals. But they would only put their trust in someone who had that doctorate. Even though it may not be in the Bible, it may be in something else. But my point is, I think that's the way they were viewing Paul. You know, you're not that important. We're going to put our faith in someone else. And Paul was going back, listen, if they're preaching and teaching that which is an error, they're wrong. And it doesn't matter who.
How easy is it for a congregation of God-fearing good people to be swayed in the wrong way. How easy is that to happen?
That was Paul's point back in verse, what, 3?
Yeah,
Just-
that's what's happening. Listen, these deceivers are, and here's a word, when I think about them, imposters. That's what they were imposters.
And I think they were downplaying Paul. Well, who are you? You know,
Yeah.
you don't have, you know, this notoriety or this whatever. And I think that's why Paul said, I'm not a bit behind the chiefest apostles, if you want to play that game.
If that's what we're gonna do, then here's where I really am.
Yeah.
It's sad that it went that way. All right. Verse 16. I say again, let no man think me a fool, if otherwise, yet as a fool receive me, that I may boast myself a little. So, you know, he may appear to be foolish in their eyes. Listen, they're the ones that are putting Paul in this position. Verse 17, that which I speak it not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly, in this confidence of boasting. Is Paul saying in this one area that this is my thought, that this is how I feel? Very well could be. I'm not really sure. I kind of struggle with that verse, but he said that which I speak not after the Lord, but as it were foolishly, which is what they are in this confidence of boasting. Verse 18, seeing that that many may glory after the flesh, I will also glory. So bear with me just a minute, he's saying. And that's what Paul is saying. For ye suffer fools gladly, seeing yourselves so wise. For you suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. I speak as concerning reproach, as though we had been weak. However, wheresoever any is bold, I speak foolishly. I am bold also. And Paul is going to explain all of that a little later on in this chapter. He didn't want to appear to be foolish in their eyes. So what he is about to say is going to appear foolish. It is. He didn't want them to think of him as a foolish individual. So he said, just bear with me a moment. But if that's how you think, he said, accept me. Allow me the opportunity to boast just a little. Because I need to say some things. That's what Paul is telling them. I need to say some things about myself that you may not even be aware of. And so he's upholding his work as an apostle. Paul was an inspired man of God. He was an inspired, an apostle inspired of the Holy Spirit. But this is not normally how an inspired writer, an inspired man would be speaking. It's foolish for him to stand up and say, I am this. But listen, they're really pushing him into this. So, as these teachers had done, I guess when they came along the church there, Paul said, well, I have a little to say about me. So they came in, and here's the situation. As I see it, they came in, bragging on themselves, patting themselves on the back. Paul says, give me just a minute. Let me be foolish too. I'm going to tell you some things about me. That's how I see this. Okay? So Paul is really not foolish. He is acting somewhat foolish to make a point here.
I think he's being forced to do that. It feels like it.
Yes, and I think so. So Paul is going to give a list of things, how that he had suffered. He gives a list of things, I guess, of how they had suffered to begin with. Because he said, if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalts himself. And so he's talking about what is actually happening to them. The Corinthians were tolerating this kind of attitude and these kinds of people, but were jealously suspicious of Paul. Doesn't really make sense. And so that's the situation. That's what's happening. And he said, basically, I'm just as bold as they are. I can talk just like they talk. Then he goes and he begins to talk that way. Verses 22, verses 22 and 23. Are they Hebrews? Well, so what? I'm a Hebrew. You know, sounds kind of silly, doesn't it, to have to talk like that. Are they Israelites? Well, so am I. I'm an Israelite. I'm equal to them there. Are they the seed of Abraham? Oh, well, I am too. So am I. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors, more abundant. In strife, above measure. In prisons, more frequent. In deaths, oft. This is who I am. I'm the apostle, and here's who I am. You know, both of Paul's parents were Hebrews. Lived in a town called Tarsus. Educated by one of the premier teachers of his day, Gamaliel. Are the Israelites? Well, he was not a proselyte. You know, a lot of the Jews were proselytes. Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews, right? A Jew of Jews. Are they the seed of Abraham? I am. Not only spiritually, but fleshly. I'm an Israelite. Are they ministers of Christ? I'm even more a minister. Up to this point, the similarities were there. But at this point, there's a great difference that enters into the picture. Paul far exceeds them as ministers of the gospel. You know, not looking at his apostleship, but looking at him as a traveling preacher. And what he's done. In reality, no servant of Christ could say, I have surpassed what Paul has done. He said, I speak as a foolish person, saying these things. And he gives some more reasons. Listen to the reasons. If you need to stop me to make a comment, just stop me. I'm trying to get through most of this if we can. Are they ministers of Christ? Verse 23. Are they ministers of Christ? I speak as a fool. I am more. In labors, more abundant. In stripes, above measure. In prisons, more frequent. More frequent. In deaths, often. Of the Jews, 5 times I received 40 stripes, save one. Thrice I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. Thrice I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day I've been in the deep. And journeyings often. In perils of water. Perils of robbers. And perils of my own countrymen. In perils by the heathen. In perils in the city. In perils of the wilderness. In perils in the sea. In perils among false brethren. In weariness and painfulness. In watchings often. Hunger and thirst and fastings. Often and cold and naked. Besides those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily are the care of all the churches. So Paul had labored so abundantly, and he had had all of these experiences which were hard and difficult. I bet he's thinking, how many of you that say you're ministers? I wonder how many of you have been through this? It's foolishness for him to have to say these things, but it's necessary. And everything Paul has said has been substantiated. Go back to the book of Acts and just look at what Paul endured. Just a very hard life, but he faced it head on. Any comments? Verse 29, who is weak? And I am not weak. Who is offended? And I burn not. If I must needs glory, I will glory of the things which concern mine infirmities. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, which is blessed forevermore, knoweth that I lie not. In Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, kept the city of Damascus with a garrison, desirous to apprehend me, and through a window in a basket was I let down by the wall and escaped his hands. You know, Paul was like most men. He wasn't superhuman. He was just a man.
But Tony, I think the point he's probably making in essence, why have I gone through all these things? because of the preaching of the gospel,
Yes.
because of doing that which is right and good. If I were a fake or fraud, I surely wouldn't be doing all this, but because of what he's been doing, he's preaching and teaching, I think that's the idea. Look what's,
Yeah, we'll come back next week and talk more about this, and I think,
Sounds like there's doubting.
huh?
It sounds like there's doubting him.
They
Like
were.
they didn't want to believe him or trust him, and
But the proof is there, his love for them, his love for the church, his love for God. So we'll come back, finish this up, answer the questions next week. Appreciate everyone's attention and comments.